Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second event of our webinar series on the impact of Korean popular culture on North America. My name is Seung-Kyung Kim. I am Korea Foundation Professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures and Director of the Institute for Korean Studies at Indiana University. The Embassy of the Republic of Korea in the USA and Indiana University Bloomington are co-hosting the webinar series on this timely and important topic. Our first webinar featuring Dr. Sida Balseji was a huge success with over 900 people viewing the event. Dr. Seji's talk introduced important questions such as what is Korean popular music and how is it different from American popular music? And how does it continue to attract new audiences despite linguistic barriers? Her presentation was informative, fascinating, and dynamic, and she guided the audience through a historical overview of Korean popular music. I was also really impressed by the questions raised by the audience. They covered a wide range of topics and gave Dr. Seji an opportunity to expand on some of the most interesting parts of her talk. If anyone missed the talk, it is now on YouTube. You can find it by simply typing in the impact of Korean popular culture on North America. As I said 2 weeks ago, the lectures in this series by Dr. Sida Balseji, Candace Epps Robertson, Jenny Wang Medina, and Michelle Zhou introduce Korean popular music, literature, film, and TV dramas, and explain how Americans are learning to appreciate these vibrant forms of Korean popular culture. Taken together, they provide an in-depth orientation for those interested in understanding this fascinating cultural phenomenon. As of now, we have over 850 people registered for tonight's lecture by Dr. Candace Epps Robertson, and I hope that all of you join the remaining 2 lectures at 8:30 p.m. on November 5th and November 19th. Now I will turn to Dr. Susan Huang, who will moderate today's event.
Thank you, Professor Kim. Good evening, everyone. My name is Susan Huang, and I'm an assistant professor of Korean literature and cultural studies in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures at Indiana University. I will be moderating tonight's session and the Q&A following the presentation. We are anticipating an exciting and engaging hour and a half ahead of us, all the more because in revision to Professor Kim's estimation, we now have over 1,000 people who have pre-registered for tonight's event. So at any point during the presentation and the Q&A that will follow, please use the Q&A tool to submit your questions for the speaker. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Candace Epps Robertson. Dr. Epps Robertson is an assistant professor in the Department of English and Comparative Literature and director of the writing in the disciplines program at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She teaches classes in cultural rhetorics, literacy, and writing studies. Her research examines the ways in which communities teach, learn, and think about what it means to be global citizens outside of traditional school spaces. Her first book, The Race to Erase Brown, which was published by the University of Pittsburgh Press in 2018, examines a literacy program that promoted ideas about global citizenship practices for a small African-American community in the Southern United States during the American Civil Rights Movement. Currently, she is working on 2 projects that focus on BTS Fandom Army. In the first project, She examines the fandom as a site for transcultural learning and exchange around social justice practices and ideas about global citizenship. A second project works to document and analyze how members of this community archive their experiences. She is also part of a collaborative effort to create a BTS syllabus for teaching, research, and archiving. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Candace Epps Robertson.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction. Phoenix, would you please share the screen? All right, would you make it large? Got it, thank you. Okay, I'd like to express my gratitude to the Embassy for the Republic of Korea in Washington, DC, and the Institute for Korean Studies at the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies at Indiana University for sponsoring and organizing this series. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. 2 weeks ago, Dr. Seiji provided an overview of the history of K-pop and its reception in North America. This week, I have the pleasure of talking to you about one particular Korean music group, BTS, and their global fandom known as ARMY. Next slide, please. I'd like to share just a bit more about who I am in relation to this work. I work in cultural rhetorics and literacy studies. I'm interested in how words, images, sounds, and spaces move people to take action and create and share knowledge. I'm often asked how a rhetorician came to be interested in studying BTS and ARMY. The answer to this question usually comes in the form of another question, something academics like to do. And that question is this: how do 7 artists from South Korea become a common point that brings together people from around the world? I think this map made by Nicole Santero, a PhD student who creates these visuals of ARMY Twitter engagement, is a beautiful representation of that connectivity. BTS and ARMY connect across borders that often seem impermeable. For me, this means that there is much to learn, study, and discuss. However, I must begin with this disclaimer. There's no way I can cover the entire history and impact in this Zoom space. It would take a series of webinars, books, articles, podcasts, and more to be able to capture the range of impact and experiences we see in this community. I do hope this will be a start, especially for those who are new to the topic. There'll also be a handout that I'll share and that will be uploaded on the website as well, where you went to register, should people be interested in learning more about the research. Next slide, please. I will offer this overview by answering 3 questions that I think many who are new to learning about BTS and ARMY are most often curious about. Who makes up the ARMY community? What kinds of messages are being shared by BTS? And how does ARMY respond? Finally, how might we understand BTS and ARMY to have the potential to impact North American culture through their synergistic relationship? In answering these questions, I want to demonstrate that one of the impacts I see is the way this community offers possibilities for cross-cultural learning and exchange. Before I proceed, however, this would not be a holistic presentation about BTS and ARMY if I didn't start with the music. The music is usually what brings someone to BTS. I'd like to play for you just a bit of one BTS music video on Kinetic Manifesto film Come Prima, which premiered back in February of this year. The song On is from their 2020 Map of the Soul 7 album. Next slide and video, please. As you might imagine, I struggled with deciding which music video to share because there are so many. On is one of the recent examples I often point to when I describe the way in which BTS's music and music videos are often an amalgamation of musical genres, sounds, visuals, and connections to their previous work. This video and song are representative of what I think some people may think about when they hear the name BTS. Together, the vocal and rap lines deliver lyrics that tell us of BTS's struggles, resilience, and the strength they found in one another. The lines, "Can't hold me down because you know I'm a fighter," could be understood as a kind of BTS manifesto. The music video, which proceeds like a short film, and I'll encourage you to watch it with sound and in full after our talk, feels like an extension of this message as BTS tells their story surrounded with the drumline and dancers bearing witness. Next slide, please. Now I'll ask you a question. Do you know BTS? Chances are if you are here, you do, or you're curious to learn more. To know ARMY, you have to start with the music, and to know the music, we've also got to start with the group. BTS is a 7-member boy band from South Korea who debuted in June of 2013 under the management of Big Hit Entertainment, a company whose motto is Music and Artists for Healing. The name BTS is an acronym for Bangtan Sonyeondan, which translates to Bulletproof Boy Scouts. One of the reasons expressed for this name was that they sought to be a group whose music offered a shield for youth facing negative stereotypes. In 2017, it was announced that BTS would stand for Beyond the Scene. Next slide, please. The members' stage names are RM, Jin, Suga, J-Hope, Jimin, V, and Jungkook. This graphic offers both their stage names and Korean names, along with their musical roles as being either singers or rappers, although sometimes those lines get blurred. In addition to performing across the globe for millions, BTS has spoken at the United Nations General Assembly and Korea's first Youth Day, among many other public events. They've captured the attention of not only the general public and casual listeners, but world leaders, researchers, and of course, a fandom that spans the globe. While BTS debuted as a hip-hop based group, their focus as artists has incorporated music that crosses and blends genres. They've come to bring their own unique sound to the music industry. The members are active with regard to writing their own lyrics and being part of the production process as well. This direct input has meant songs that speak to a range of issues, from mental health, love, loss, angst, to social critique. Next slide, please. BTS and Big Hit are also known for their innovative approach to how fans experience music, from the fictional universe known as the Bangtan universe, or BU, which includes a storyline that complements narratives found in some of their songs, to their most recent adaptation of what it means to experience concerts online with Map of the Soul 1. Both BTS and Big Hit have made quite an impression on how music and content are developed and shared, and how fans are included in this process. This slide includes just a small sampling of some of that content, from the webtoon, which offered BU content, the music itself, social media interaction through Twitter and V Lives, which are when a member or members have a live stream to chat with fans, to a global art exhibit, Connect BTS, that we'll talk about a little later. There's a range of content for fans to experience. Next slide. Those writing about BTS's history have noted that the group faced many obstacles from their start. They came from a small company, small at the time, and their popularity took time to build. Even still, early performances, particularly those in the United States, showed that the group had a dedicated fan base. In BTS The Review, music critic Kim Young-dae notes that as early as 2014, BTS had what he described as a grassroots style of a bottom-up fan base. Even with small shows and limited performances in the United States. Here they are in 2014 at KCON in Los Angeles. And KCON, for those who don't know, is an annual convention that brings Korean culture through music, food, products, and experiences like panels and fan meets to fans outside of Korea. I think it's important to mention this bit of history with regard to BTS because it reminds us that they've had a presence in North America for longer than some may believe. Next slide. While it could be argued that BTS achieved even more mainstream attention since 2017 with their performance on the American Music Awards, along with other American television appearances, the most important takeaway here is to remember that ARMY has been present and growing since their debut. There is no way I could list all of their accolades and awards. I'm quite sure that that would take the entirety of our time together. But it is important to know that they've topped charts in both Korea and abroad, and of course have broken numerous records with sales, streams, and views across platforms. Most recently, their single Dynamite, I just had to check this before, but has been on the Billboard Top 100 for 3 weeks at #1, 4 weeks at #2, and 1 week at #5. In addition to recognition for their music, BTS has also received prestigious cultural honors as well. In 2018, they were the youngest to receive the Hwagan Order of Cultural Merit in Korea. This award is given for outstanding services in art and culture. And they were recently presented with the 2020 Korea Society James A. Van Fleet Award, given to recognize outstanding contributions to the promotion of US-Korean relations. BTS's musical achievements and global presence has garnered lots of attention. And with almost every opportunity they are given, you will find that BTS takes time to thank their fandom, ARMY. Next slide, please. Do you know ARMY? ARMY is an acronym that stands for Adorable Representative MC for Youth. The name was given to the fandom not long after their debut in 2013. ARMY is widely known for their support of BTS's music. While fandoms are sometimes described using terms like collectives or masses, it is important to remember that people enter into these spaces as individuals with any number of interests, beliefs, and worldviews, and the ARMY community is no exception. Yes, they are here to support BTS, but they may choose to express that support within the community in any number of ways. Next slide. To get definitive numbers about the size of ARMY is a challenge, as you might imagine, but we do have some data and research that can help us to understand a bit about this population. I also want to mention that there's currently an ARMY-driven effort right now underway to compile census data from over 400,000 ARMY all over the world. And even that we know will still provide only a part of the picture. What we have been able to glean from surveys and analysis and research is that ARMY is a very diverse community. And over the years, we have seen BTS's popularity grow across older demographics. One of the ways we've seen this is through web traffic, as this graphic shows, for BTS concert tickets. For example, according to Vivid Seats, when ticket sales for the Love Yourself tour went on sale in 2018, 43% of fans searching for tickets on the BTS ticket site were women between the ages of 18 and 24. 2 years later, just 24% belonged to that demographic when tickets to Map of the Soul Persona tour went on sale, and women over the age of 45 doubled from 7.5% to over 16%. There are often many assumptions made about who makes up ARMY, from claims that the fandom is full of screaming teenagers, which in and of itself is problematic because there's nothing wrong with being an enthusiastic young person, to claims that ARMY is made up of mindless bots. These claims are often rooted in harmful stereotypes about boy band fandoms in general and negate the diversity and intelligence present in many facets of this community. Historically, we also know that fans of K-pop groups have been known to be diverse across age, gender, identity, ethnic backgrounds, and professions. Next slide. This aspect of diversity is something that has especially become a significant talking point for the ARMY fandom when highlighting what makes them special and unique. I think another way to look at who ARMY is through the diversity of ARMY Twitter accounts, both in terms of how they represent the expertise and professions people bring with them into the community, as well as the range of interests people share, from graphic design, cooking, tutoring services, book clubs, writers, those in the medical fields, translators, and more. And I'd also add alongside this that while I think numbers and metrics from social media are certainly important, we have to remember that these numbers aren't going to give us a completely accurate account no matter how exhaustive, as not all ARMY participate on these platforms. I think having more research to help us unpack these numbers is important. Next slide. How does one become ARMY is a question I often get. At its most basic, I think it could be argued that being a fan who is supportive of BTS is what makes you ARMY. There is a formal fan club, which is a paid membership with benefits like access to ticket raffles for concerts, but someone can be ARMY and not be in the fan club or participate in buying merchandise. What I feel is important to stress is that there are so many different pathways that people find into this community. For some, it starts with a friend who makes a song recommendation. For others, it's a foray down the Bangtan rabbit hole, as some call the process of seeing a YouTube clip that makes them curious about a performance or music video. And hours later, they find themselves still watching and maybe even starting their first Twitter account. For others, it might be the efforts to give back to others as a reflection of the joy and happiness they feel from BTS. If you talk to ARMY who've most recently found BTS, say during the COVID-19 pandemic, you may hear that the joy of watching BTS create, perform, or talk about their daily lives during this time is what made them curious. I'd mention here again that while being ARMY does not mean one has to be part of an online experience, for many, these platforms are important because they provide opportunities to connect, network, and communicate with others in the fandom. Social media and online spaces are integral to how much of the community communicates and organizes. However, we know that these spaces are not without their own problems. I could talk at great length about the pathways into this community, but thought I'd share a short clip with you so that you can hear other ARMY experiences. And this clip is from an MTV News segment back in 2018 about ARMY. Let's make sure we have the sound right too.
On the day of BTS's historic Citi Field concert, volunteers from One in an Army, a fan-driven global charity initiative, were collecting canned goods and blankets just across the street to give to local organizations City Harvest and Coalition for the Homeless.
We're doing this as a thank you to New York for being so hospitable to BTS and to the ARMY.
We are dedicated fans, we are loyal fans, but we also wanted to show that we instill goodwill in each ARMY. Once you get one person involved, it's like a chain reaction to everybody else.
Even if we only do a small thing, that can be a big thing for somebody else.
We want to make them proud. We do. We really do.
For ARMY, these simple acts of kindness bring them closer to BTS and to each other. Purple Ribbon Army, another fan-led initiative, was also outside Citi Field handing out purple ribbon wristbands. They serve as reminders to concertgoers to be respectful to their fellow ARMYs. Purple is a significant color for BTS, inspired by member V's favorite phrase.
I purple you.
It started off as an airport project where we would use a ribbon to barricade the ARMYs and other fans that wanted to see them so that the boys can travel through the airport without getting hurt, and it also ensured the safety of other ARMY members as well.
At Citi Field, BTS fans from around the world came together to celebrate a group they say has changed their lives in a multitude of meaningful ways.
BTS has changed my life because I just met a bunch of random people online and now they're my closest friends. They give so much to us, they help empower us so much.
I started listening to BTS last summer and I was infatuated with the choreography. I just decided that I wanted to try the dance, and now like 2 years later, I'm obsessed with them. I'm a teenager and I struggle with a lot of emotional stuff, like personal problems. Music nowadays, it's cool, it's good, but there's nothing like BTS. It directly talks to a teenager. Depression, anxiety, social problems, all that I suffer with, I deal with. Every day at my high school, during lunch period or gym, I would go upstairs to this empty room and I would dance there for 45 minutes to an hour every single day.
To me, their music is everything. It came at a point in my life when I didn't know who I was as a person. I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. But to have these, these boys just come out and be like, hey, it's okay, you'll figure it out. Don't worry about it. Just do you and do the best that you can, was really, really great.
Through their music and philanthropy, BTS
Listen to enough Army stories and experiences, you'll gather that while many find different pathways into the fandom, there's almost always this sentiment reflected of being both grateful for the community and music, as well as finding BTS when they felt like they needed to find them the most. I'd like to invite any Army who might be watching this webinar to share your Army story, if you're on Twitter, by using the hashtag #MyArmyStory. How did you come to find BTS, and what does this community mean to you? I never get tired of asking this question and listening to the responses. And perhaps for those who are listening to learn more, if you're on Twitter, this will be an opportunity for you to hear individual stories too. Now we've talked about BTS and we've talked a bit about Army. I'd like to focus next on what connects the two. What messages does BTS share and how does Army respond? Next slide, please. BTS's catalog touches on topics, as I've said, that transcend boundaries of language and country. They've offered reflections on fear, encouraged people to find their passion and live their own dreams. Also important, they have given us anthems for joy and happiness. Part of what I found to be most interesting in my own research is the call and response, or invitation and reception, between the ways in which BTS share these messages and how Army chooses to take them up. Here too is where we see the opportunity for cross-cultural connection and solidarity. Many of the themes, feelings, and messages across their songs are not limited to being experienced by a particular culture or demographic. Dr. Lee Ji-young, author of BTS Art Revolution, notes that while some of BTS's messages certainly start from a South Korean context or perspective, such as their songs that spoke about the struggles of Korean youth and the pressures of academics, these are issues that are not limited by borders and languages. Next slide. I would add to this that BTS's messages also come from their public address. From their Dear Class of 2020 YouTube presentations to their most recent speeches at the United Nations General Assembly, they often share these calls for awareness and solidarity by sharing their own experiences. As I look at the research that I've collected that focuses on the North American experience through surveys, interviews, Twitter, and YouTube analysis, along with research in progress by scholars across disciplines, what seems to overwhelmingly mark this experience is this possibility for cultural exchange and learning within the fandom. These opportunities for knowledge sharing and building often start from the connection armies feel with BTS's messages, as those armies explained in the previous clip. In my work as a rhetorician, I refer to the way BTS offers its messages as being an invitational rhetoric, because the messages are left open for interpretation and action, which results in responses that are organic to members of the community. Essentially, this means people can listen, decide what's important or meaningful to them, and how and if they wish to respond. I think this is an important way to think about the responses because it allows us to look at them on different levels, not just at the level of the collective. I also think that there's a strength in this, in that any number of issues or causes can be addressed by members of the community. Responses can be at the level of an individual, a small group chat of Army friends, or even larger. For example, you could have someone who blogs or tweets about the ways particular lyrics help them to think critically about issues or take action against something like bullying or stigmas around mental health. A group chat could provide opportunities for discussion about topics introduced by BTS or any number of conversations within the fandom. And at the larger level, as I'll discuss in just a bit, Army can start grassroots campaigns to address inequalities through awareness and philanthropic efforts. Next slide. Perhaps one of the most talked about messages from BTS has come from their Love Yourself album series and their work with the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF. In 2017, BTS and Big Hit partnered with the Korean Committee for UNICEF to join the End Violence campaign with the BTS Love Myself initiative, focusing on the prevention of violence against young people. This message was described as being reflective of BTS's expressions of social messages also found in their lyrics and music videos, and their desire to have love and hope be resistance against hate and violence. The overarching concept for the Love Yourself trilogy albums also echoed this message of the importance of loving oneself as a first step towards fostering self-respect and awareness of one's place in the world. Next slide. One of the Army responses to this message would result in the creation of One in an Army. This is a fan-driven organization that helps to raise funds and awareness about a variety of human rights and social issues. One in an Army's origin story, which I'd encourage you to read in full on their website, and I'll have links to that on that handout, began when one Army tweeted to ask if other fans would take part in a project for the End Violence, BTS Love Myself projects, or a Syrian relief project. Army responded to this call, and this organization began with their first official project in April of 2018. One in an Army is made up of Army volunteers from around the world. These volunteers ask for input from other Army with regard to which nonprofits or issues they should run campaigns for. They use Twitter to organize calls for micro donations. They've done campaigns for a range of nonprofits, from those that support pet programs for the elderly to COVID-19 relief. For each member's birthday, they will run a campaign in their name and honor. Additionally, they coordinate projects that don't just raise funds, but are equally important as they encourage acts of kindness. I also want to mention here that fan groups around the world often run their own charity projects in a similar manner in support of a particular issue, and often done in honor of a BTS member's birthday. We'll watch just a few minutes of One in an Army's video recap of 2019 so that you can get a perspective of the range of different projects that they run. Video, please. The organizing for fundraising and Army's responses to these efforts is certainly impressive, not only because of the money raised, but also because of the opportunities it provides for people to learn about issues that they otherwise may not be aware of. One in an Army stresses the importance of projects that are a reflection of the messages and comfort found through the actions of BTS. They write, quote, "The vision behind One in an Army is driven by our belief that the comfort which we get from BTS can be given back to the world in abundance. It also aligns with our personal objective as individuals to work in making this world a better place," end quote. There are two things I want to highlight from this statement. First is the importance of responding to this invitational aspect of BTS's message, and the importance, as One in an Army so clearly defines, of remembering that individuals with their own worldviews and beliefs exist within this collective. These efforts provide another opportunity for transcultural education and exchange. For example, earlier in October, there was a campaign in honor of Jimin's birthday that raised money for Free the Girls, an organization that helps girls who are rescued from sex trafficking. You can see in these screenshots that One in an Army is initiating questions about the issue in a way that encourages discussions about these issues and how they may be related to other issues or concerns across communities. Next slide, please. Similarly, an examination of how some Army responded to the Black Lives Matter movement during June of 2020 again sheds light on the community as a place for education and exchange. In the wake of the murder of George Floyd and protests for attention to the issues of violence and racism against Black people, there were concerted efforts within the fandom to raise money and awareness for Black Lives Matter. These efforts, many of which started before BTS made their tweet about Black Lives Matter, were driven by fans and received a great deal of media attention. Some seemed surprised that fans were capable of such quick and effective organizing around a social justice issue. I suspect that some of this shock also comes again from the misrepresentation of who fans are and not realizing that fans often bring any number of commitments with them into these spaces, such as social justice issues and causes, and that acts of charity have long been part of many of these communities. In this instance, for some, it didn't take BTS making a donation or tweeting to feel called to organize. The magnitude of the response and fundraising would result in the Match a Million campaign. On their website, One in an Army, which helped to facilitate some of this organization, notes that Army had raised approximately $50,000 prior to the announcement of BTS's $1 million donation on June 6. 24 hours later, after two Army would tweet to suggest that Army could match the funds donated by BTS, Army would indeed match $1 million. This story can also be found in full on the One in an Army website. Again, I'll link that, and I would encourage you to read that as well. Again, this organizing and the amount raised are certainly important to recognize, but the attempts to educate deserve attention too. In one of my projects, I identified, track, and analyze how this kind of education was happening through stories, hashtags, and art. There were resources offered that helped to explain the history of anti-Blackness and racism in both American and global context, as well as personal stories shared. Some might think that this was an opportunity for only fans outside of North America to learn about race and racism, but I would argue that it became a moment for everyone to reckon with. It's equally important to recognize that some of these attempts to educate and exchange information were met with critique or resistance. This resistance is worthy of unpacking, and while not the focus of this webinar, I will say it demonstrates that no community is exempt from having to deal with such issues. Next slide. Thus far, we've talked about how some find their way into this fandom, the demographics of the community, and the possibilities for those who are open to learn about a range of social issues. Now we'll turn to another BTS message with additional implications for cultural learning and exchange. In September of 2018, BTS attended the United Nations General Assembly as part of the launch of UNICEF's Generation Unlimited campaign. The campaign's focus is on providing opportunities and access for education and training for young people. RM gave a speech in which he described the challenges that many people face with feeling the need to fit the expectations that others have for us. Through reflecting on his own experiences, he called on people to build from the lesson and practice of loving oneself and to use that as the foundation to speak yourself. In words that have been often cited and shared across social media, RM would request, quote, "Tell me your story. I want to hear your voice and I want to hear your conviction. No matter who you are, where you're from, your skin color, gender identity, speak yourself." End quote. This too is not a message that was packaged or reserved only for this particular presentation or moment. Rather, spending time with BTS's catalog shows that this message of leaning into oneself, valuing one's voice, experience, and identity is ever present, along with the recognition of the strength and courage needed to do this. To some, messages about loving yourself and speaking yourself may feel overly simplistic or too light given the severity of the world. However, when put into context with contemporary discourse that often values assimilation alongside the bombardment of messages we are faced with daily, these messages do carry weight. Perhaps, though, the real impact of these messages is best evaluated when we see how fans respond. Next slide. As a scholar in literacy studies, I've been particularly interested in the ways in which Army has developed independent community-sponsored literacy projects as a way of having their voices and stories told. To date, there is one independent interdisciplinary academic journal, the Rhythmatic Revolution Review, an independent press, Revolutionaries, 4 digital magazines, Borzak Vision, Army Magazine, Dream Glow, and Revolution Magazine. I'm quite sure that Army will let me know if I've forgotten one, so I apologize. Things change rapidly in this community. They each have a different focus, but in reviewing mission statements and about pages for these publications, what is clear is that each value having opportunities for Army knowledge and experience to be shared. They promote reflection, creativity, and seek to publish about a range of issues. Again, coming back to illustrate that in this response and action of creating independent community-driven publications lies the possibility for cross-cultural dialogue and exchange about a variety of issues. I find these initiatives to be particularly powerful because we often hear that fan knowledge and experience is sometimes dismissed based on the assumption that fans lack objectivity. I think we have to trouble this notion just a bit because in some instances, it is often the case that fans have the most unique and critical observations because they are approaching from a stance of wanting their community to be a better place and because they care so deeply for the music, art, and artists. So I see these publication outlets, many of which boldly state that they are committed to talking not only about issues related to BTS, but also those that are tangentially related. Again, BTS is the common point, but the opportunity to learn and connect over other issues is there too. These independent community publishing sites are responding both to a need to have spaces where fan knowledge and perspectives are centered, and they offer a space to engage critically with a range of issues. I serve on the editorial board for the Rhythmatic Revolution Review and briefly can share a bit about how we are responding to this message. As an interdisciplinary journal committed to publishing work that explores and examines BTS and topics related to BTS across a range of genres, disciplines, and perspectives, our focus is on sharing knowledge and supporting the writers and creators publishing with us. This is a direct reflection of the kind of mutual respect and collective creativity we see in BTS and Army. The journal is not an Army-only publishing zone, but having Army serve on the advisory and editorial boards, as well as reviewers, in addition to academics, and in roles throughout the organization is one attempt to acknowledge and center the experiences that Army uniquely bring into this publishing process. In this way, the journal both responds to and amplifies the call to speak ourselves. And this engagement and learning are happening as a result of this shared center point, BTS. Next slide, please. I've spoken about the messages from BTS as being inspiration, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the ways in which actively experiencing BTS's music is also a site for learning and exchange. This experience can be complicated and varies for each individual. For some, it's paying attention to the lyrics, catching the melody, maybe watching a music video or performance several times over to catch nuances and connections. The artistry of BTS builds a complex archives of experiences and connections that are enticing for many North American Army who want to both engage with the music and think creatively alongside the artists and other fans. And I would wager that while our focus in this webinar is on the North American Army, or North American culture and impact there, that this experience probably holds true for Army all over the world who want to think creatively alongside the artists and participate in this way. For Army, for example, for Army whose native language and culture is not Korean, listening to BTS's music can be the first step into learning about Korean language, culture, and history. To understand the lyrics, you'll find that some Armies are working as diligently as academics who work with literature and translation. For example, it often means that one is working across several translations. Most often, these translations are found on Twitter or blogs that are created for free by Army translators. In addition to reading multiple translations, as each translator may have their own style, One may also have to do research in Korean history to gain further context for songs, nuances, performances, and music videos. During the recent BTS takeover on The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon, BTS's performance of Idol inspired Twitter threads about the history and context for those who were not familiar with the palace where they performed. Likewise, when BTS performed Dynamite on America's Got Talent, there were threads about the amusement park where they filmed. There's another interesting practice amongst some ARMY, and these are probably some of my favorite videos to view. But these are travel vlogs, often posted to YouTube, that offer accounts for those who visit Korea. Many take the opportunity to see the places where BTS have recorded music videos, grabbed a bite to eat, or maybe spots that they've mentioned in a V Live. I've been watching these vlogs, mostly from North American ARMY, and cataloging them for a project about fandom memory and archiving. And what never gets old is the careful planning, research, and attention that many fans give in order to be able to experience these spaces, not just for BTS, but for building additional connections to Korean culture and experiences. At a cursory glance, one might assume that these travelers are only replicating what they've seen BTS do. But I've watched enough to know that part of what they are doing is real research, to be able to put these visits into context with larger lessons about Korean culture and history. They are not only archiving their experiences as ARMY, but they are also working to educate themselves and others about Korea. Next slide, please. As I previously mentioned, BTS and Big Hit are quite innovative with regard to creating ways to experience art and music. Earlier this year, as part of their Map of the Soul 7 album release, there was a worldwide art project called Connect BTS that was part of the experience. Spanning 5 cities, London, Berlin, Buenos Aires, Seoul, and New York, and including 22 artists, this project had a bold mission. She hit play on it to make sure it's going. Thank you. Quote, to redefine the relationship between art and music, the material and immaterial, artists and their audiences, artist and artists, theory and practice. A worldwide exhibition may not be something that some would think about or come to expect with an album release, but it's sort of emblematic to both BTS and ARMY in that it disrupted boundaries around how we think about bringing art into the world. I end with this project as another example of education and exchange, not only for the obvious reasons, but because I think it represents what BTS has done for many, and that is to offer us opportunities to see new connections amongst ourselves and the world. Next slide. At the start of our time together, I mentioned that the primary takeaway from this webinar would be a demonstration that one of the markers of the ARMY experience in the North American context is this opportunity for cross-cultural connection and exchange. I hope that you've seen that through what I've provided, but I also hope that you are left with the recognition that this is a dynamic community that cannot be easily categorized or defined, much like BTS. From ARMY theorists who are breaking down quantum mechanics to ARMY donating their own time to teach Korean to others or providing cooking recipes for those who want to try Korean food at home. This is a community where opportunities to learn from people all over the world are abound. I find that there's a power, a strength, and a remarkable sense of hope and curiosity anytime we are examining or talking about something that cannot easily be contained. I hope then that you will feel encouraged to continue to listen, watch, and maybe even experience this community for yourself. Next slide. We started this presentation with music and we'll end with just a bit of music as well. On August 21st, BTS released Dynamite, their first song, as I mentioned before, to be #1 on the Billboard Top 100 chart several times over. So here's just a bit of Dynamite to get some of those questions going. Thank you so much for listening and for allowing me to be part of this conversation.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Epps Robertson, for the wonderful talk. Okay. We will now direct some of the questions raised by the audience to Dr. Epps Robertson. Okay. The first question raised was, have you looked into the impact of BTS lyrics in with respect to the ARMY fandom?
So I don't have a project myself that is doing just that, but I do know that there has been research done on how the lyrics have been not only a source of inspiration, but a way for people to connect and talk about issues. So I know that there is work that's being done on that. There are also several projects that I'm aware of that look at the issue of what it means to unpack and understand lyrics and translation as well.
Mm-hmm. So the next question then is, what impact does the BTS and ARMY have on the current racial conflict in the US? Why and how can BTS facilitate and promote K-pop fans' participation in politics?
Those are two big questions, I think. I'll try to take the first one. With regard to thinking about conversations about race, I think that participating in the fandom is one way, as I talked about, for people to learn more about histories of race and racism, both in North America and abroad. And it can become a space where people can be educated and ask questions if they feel safe and encouraged to do so and to learn more. I think that BTS's message of inclusivity and solidarity is also perhaps a source of inspiration for some. With regard to how BTS influence American politics, I think we have to be careful with making assumptions about BTS as political figures. I think it depends on how you define politics, for one. And I often say, when I'm asked about, the fandom with regard to political situations, that I think it's really important, again, to remember that people enter into these communities and spaces as individuals, and they have all kinds of beliefs and leanings. And so it's hard to categorize the fandom, I think, as being some type of political unit. And so I try to avoid that language again and focus again on the level of individuals coming into these spaces with any numbers of beliefs and concerns. I hope I answered. Those felt like two really big questions. I hope I attempted to answer them.
How impactful do you think are these video hosting platforms like YouTube or TikTok have been in the formation, connectivity, and creativity of ARMY? And examples there might be things like fan videos, analysis videos, news coverage videos, cover videos, or style or even fashion videos.
Oh, I think that's an excellent question. And it's something that I didn't mention directly in the talk, but because it gets at this idea of the fan practices and how central they are to being able to understand BTS. And so I think that, the YouTube videos that we have of the YouTube videos that ARMY creates for music video analysis, or to create and share history, like documentaries about BTS and ARMY, are integral to understanding the community as well. And they really are a means for people to connect and find not only shared interest in the fandom, but again, just to be educated about the fandom's history. As I said, I think because there are oftentimes incomplete stories told about ARMY has certainly taken it upon itself to find places where they can document their own history. And certainly YouTube, Twitter, ARMY archives, these types of projects are certainly ways that they are able to do that. So in addition to like the publications that I named, I know there are also a number of ARMY podcasters who also do this work in trying to provide history and connection amongst ARMY.
The next one is about the ARMY census. So As an army, I think we have a lot of armies in presence here today, obviously. I have not heard of that. What implications does the Army census tell us in regards to the longevity of their popularity and the impact of their international fan base? And how can this information be applied to other settings to promote cross-cultural understanding?
That is such a rich question. Unfortunately, I probably won't be able to answer it in full. I'm not part of the Army Census Project. I do know that there have been other census projects within the fandom that have tried to get an account for exactly who we are and how many there are. I think that once we have those numbers, they will also be a way, even though it won't be a full picture. Again, the census was translated into multiple languages and shared on Twitter. And as we know, not all Army are participating in social media in the same ways. But I think it'll help us again to get a better sense of who makes up the Army community. And perhaps also lead to other research about impact with regard to how messages are shared amongst Army and just what different experiences are. I think it'll be interesting and necessary to put those types of like big data projects in conversation with other research projects that look at individual experiences as well. So that we can have more dynamic data and understanding about who makes up the community. Certainly the numbers are very, very important, but there are other ways to hear and learn about Army experiences too, in addition to collecting that kind of information.
The next question is, how do you think Army's power as a fandom, as a community, affects the entertainment industry?
That's a good question. So I definitely think, and I'm certainly not someone who is privy to marketing patterns or analysis from the entertainment industry, but just being in conversation with others, I think that people are certainly paying attention. I think they're curious about what the connection is both between, perhaps between BTS, Big Hit, and Army, and how this sort of like synergy works. I think I'm also curious about exactly what it is that makes this exchange as unique and also as powerful as it is. And so I do think that people are probably really curious about the dynamics and the impact when it comes to thinking about whether or not there's a way. I often hear people say like, is there a way to replicate what Army is? I don't necessarily think you can replicate artists and a fandom in the way that question sort of implies, but I do think people are interested in knowing more about the practices that are employed by both the artist and by the fandom.
Next question. What do you think sets BTS apart from other Korean idol groups?
I try not to think about, or I try not to compare, because I think all musicians have something to offer, and certainly much of it just depends on your own preference. I think based on the research that I've done, one of the things that I think, at least from my perspective, that makes BTS, and I hesitate to say different, but one of the things that seems to be a draw for people is that BTS has never stopped trying to build a connection between themselves and their fandom. And that's not to indicate that other artists don't do that, but I'm just thinking about in conversations and interviews that I've done with other Army, this is something that typically comes up. Like they feel like they have been on this journey with BTS from the beginning and that they are still on this journey. No matter how far BTS has gone, they still feel like they're part of their story. And so I think for some, the draw to continue to be part of that story just comes from that sort of organic relationship. So no matter if they are performing, on the Grammys or have gotten X number of awards, they still take time to thank their fans. And again, I don't say that in a way to dismiss what other groups do. It's just something that I often hear in conversation with other armies, that they feel like BTS still desires a connection with their fandom, to be in conversation with them.
Thank you. And this is a new and curious army from Indonesia is here. And she's asking, I'm aware firsthand of how BTS music is very relevant to the issues of youth nowadays. I'm curious about how the demographic of 50-year-olds and older relate to the music of BTS based on your research.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is really interesting about BTS is that while there's often this focus, or there has been a focus on the engagement between BTS and young people, certainly their messages transcend age demographics as well. And so I think that whether you are, questioning your, who you are as an individual, or working through angst or fear, I think that resonates with people, like no matter where they are in life. I also think that BTS has a way of practicing like self-reflexivity, in that they know they are often very critical about themselves. And that kind of reflection, I think, is something that the older you get, now I'm speaking from my own experience, but the older you get, the more you value. And so I think to be able to see that in practice is also something that older fans perhaps are interested in. But I would also say that the music is just also an entry point for so many people. Like no matter, I don't think there's an age limit put on any of their songs in their discography. So I think it really just depends on what you're interested in and how you find that connection.
So a lot of interesting questions coming up tonight. The next one is, how does intertextuality work as a motivating factor that engages the ARMY fan base with the artist as they look for references to previous songs and details? And does this potentially work as a barrier to entry for new fans?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I will say, in all honesty, that when I first learned about BTS and first started learning more about the connections between the music and between the songs and music videos and eras, that I took copious notes. My daughter was ARMY first, and she sort of introduced me to BTS. And I would take all of these notes because I kept thinking, like, how am I supposed to understand like how all of these theories work together? I have found that, there's some fans who are really, really interested and engaged in the theories and are reading outside sources to be able to understand and put context to songs and lyrics and music videos. But I don't think you have to do that. Like, again, to go back to this idea of there being many different pathways and roles in the fandom. While there are some like self-designated ARMY theorists, there are also some of us who, at comeback time, for example, are, reading threads to try to put bits and pieces of things together. I don't think it prohibits you from experiencing the music. And I can even think of some instances where the members have said, oh, ARMY is smart, like they'll figure it out. Like maybe they don't even know the connection between certain things, but they trust that the fans do. And again, I think this goes back to the creativity with regard to the content that people are given. So while some people are really vested in looking for those clues and putting things together and reading the analysis threads, for others, it's about, experiencing the music or the music videos in another way. There are any number of ARMY guides, though, I've learned as I've been putting the syllabus together. So if people are interested, there are guides to help you sort of explore those theories. And most ARMY are very open and want to answer questions about how the eras and how the BU works.
And so this was a question that was raised in the Q&A box, as well as a question that I had for you. Are you an ARMY yourself? You mentioned that your daughter, Phoenix,
Yes.
is ARMY. So, and if you are, as you are, what is your ARMY story?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, so Phoenix found BTS. She could give us the exact date, but she found BTS in November of 2018. And I remember I picked her up from school and she asked me the question that I asked in the presentation, which is sort of a running joke amongst BTS and ARMY, but do you know BTS? And my initial response was like, what does that acronym mean? And, you know, get in the car, it's time to go home. But she spent a lot of time introducing me to the music and introducing me to the fandom as well. I think at first my curiosity really came from being a parent and wanting to understand more about what this community meant for her. And then again, as a rhetorician, my question was, how in the world are these 7 people able to connect people from like all over the world? So in thinking about speeches and thinking about messaging, you know, I wanted to figure out how it is that they're able to build this connectivity amongst people who are all so different, right? Amongst so many different individuals. So I have to thank Phoenix first and foremost for the introduction to BTS and ARMY, and then also just the community in general. I think is so open and welcoming with regard to people being curious and asking questions. But yes, I am ARMY and I am a researcher, and I do get a question related to that, like what does it mean to research a community that you're a part of? And actually, I think all of my research projects have all been around communities that in some way I am connected to. And it can be a challenge at times, but I also think it's really rewarding because I feel this sense of accountability, not just to my academic community, but to my ARMY community as well. So when I'm thinking about research or thinking about how I'm going to share knowledge or whatever it is that I'm working on, I'm always trying to think about what each community values and how I can bring that to them. It also helps, I think, to have non-ARMY friends who are curious about and supportive of your work as well.
Yeah, now that you've brought up this notion of rhetoric, there was a question raised on this notion of shared language of ARMY, especially given that the fandom is so global as it is. It seems that ARMY have their own set of shared visual jokes, phrases such as looking respectfully, etc. Is that would you say that's a product of social media platforms or an effect of how BTS utilizes these platforms?
Yeah, I think it's both. So I do think that social media, so whether it be, Twitter or people connecting and commenting on YouTube videos, or being on Instagram or Weverse, I do think those are sites and spaces where some of that interaction happens. And I also think that, it's interesting because some of it just comes with some of how you learn that just comes with being in the fandom itself. I think early on, again, speaking from my perspective, like I would ask my daughter tons of questions, why are they saying that this person is a good boy? Like, where does that come from? Or what does that mean? But you come to learn that there are histories around these terms or around these, shared jokes or stories. And social media is definitely one place where that gets exchanged. Again, I think depending on how you come into the fandom is also how you probably learn about some of these ARMY traditions and practices as well. So for me, my first experience was basically at home and learning through Phoenix. And then when I got to Twitter, I was like, oh, like there's a whole nother world of people out here and other traditions and other things that, I was not aware of until I started interacting in that space. So yes, I think social media does play a huge part in how that communication and how those shared experiences happen.
Okay. Yeah. So the next question is you mentioned that the difference between BTS and other groups is the connection they have with their fans. In regard to their immense popularity today in North America, what would you say is the thing that made them such a big hit in North America?
That is a really good question, and one that I have been trying to figure out myself, to be honest with you. And I think that, so I think there are a lot of different things that have made BTS popular. But I also think that we are going to need some time and distance away, and maybe this is the researcher in me in terms of thinking about how a phenomena happens, right? Like we need some time and distance away to be able to see like what the kairos of this particular moment has been for them. Certainly thinking about all that we've experienced collectively, for example, in 2020 with the pandemic, I think being able to experience the ways in which BTS has stayed connected with ARMY and people being at home and feeling like they, are missing out on their routine, but still, here is this group who is giving content and trying to offer comfort. I think that probably has something to do with it, but I think we also need to look at their larger history and trajectory as well with regard, not just to the content and those types of interactions, but to the music. I think that certainly plays a role. And as much as I want to say that I know like what the thing is, I don't think I do yet. Maybe other ARMY have a better handle on that, or other researchers have a handle on that. But again, I think it takes a little bit of time and distance to be able to examine a particular moment with regard to anything like, this huge, and especially with art and artists. I think it takes time to be able to say, oh, like, this was all part of this greater picture. It's also, I think, a challenge because there are so many instances where I think, oh, this might be the reason. And I'm like, then something else happens. And I'm like, wait a minute, so again, I think it takes time and space to be able to figure out what it is about this particular moment, this year, or these past couple of years, really, that have led to what we see today with regard to BTS's success.
Thank you. So the next question, the way that ARMY organizes and mobilizes is something I've never experienced in other fandom of male-dominated genre. Is there a relation with respect to the woman's gender role in organization form of a diversity such as ARMY in terms of online representation? How can we learn from the ARMY to campaign for social justice, mobilization, and online activism?
That is such a good question. And I honestly don't think I had ever really considered the role. I mean, certainly I know that women make up a large percentage of the fandom, but I don't think I had considered exactly what that meant in terms of the implications for organization. I think that what is interesting about ARMY is that even with this sort of decentralized structure, right? I think ARMY has had enough time perhaps to know how to organize, whether it be organizing around a comeback or charting or a hashtag or activism, that they have a system in place. And even in saying that, like, I think it's difficult to actually describe what it is. I think certainly it varies depending upon the practice and the action. With regard to the activism, one of the things that I think was most interesting for me in tracing the conversations that were happening amongst ARMY around Black Lives Matter was that oftentimes ARMY would point back to, like, if people were expressing resistance or maybe apathy, sometimes ARMY would point back to, BTS as a model for listening and a model for being open to hearing and expressing oneself. And so I wonder how much of that, I'm still in the midst of compiling and analyzing the data for that project, but I wonder how much of that also plays a role in that ARMY is trying to model some of these behaviors that they see BTS and putting them into practice with regard to the social justice aspect. I will say that in terms of thinking about how that happens online, I also think it's important to reiterate that we need time and we need research to be able to understand just what the impact will be. And so while it's important to look at the numbers and, you know, to certainly highlight that effort, it's also important for more research to be done so that we can actually understand like what the impact is of having these conversations about social justice issues in these communities. Like, how does that parlay into other change as well?
Okay, thank you. So the next question is, recently, BTS received the James A. Van Fleet Award due to their contributions to the promotion of US-Korea relations. But Chinese fans took offense at BTS' comment about the Korean War. So I am curious how you see this controversial issue and what your understanding of the relationship between the global fandom phenomenon and nationalism might be.
That is actually something that I hesitate to comment on, only because I don't think I've had enough time to actually sit with sources that help me to unpack that moment. And so while I know that there has been conversation and a great deal of concern for Army fans in China as well, I hesitate to really say that I have an answer. Because I think it also speaks to other issues that are at play between, you know, with regard to politics and other things that I'm probably not aware of. I don't know enough about to be able to speak to in a way that I think would give an answer that would be useful.
Okay. All right. So the next question is, do you have a sense of the impact of BTS and their messages in South Korean politics in terms of LGBTQ plus and gender equality rights?
That's a good question, and I do not. So most of my research has been focused on the North American experience and with regard to social justice. I do know that, so there was a BTS conference, an interdisciplinary conference back in January, and I'm remembering that there were at least one, maybe two papers that looked at the perspective of K-Army, especially with regard to LGBTQ and issues and social justice. So I don't know. I do think that part of what I want to do next, at least speaking from my own perspective with regard to research, is to understand what the impact is with regard to these social justice messages that we see and that we understand in the North American context, but to localize them and to figure out, or to listen rather, to what K-Army have to say about how they receive these messages. And certainly, again, I think that the important thing to remember is that no matter what locality you're looking at with regard to the fandom, the experiences are going to be different. And so it's difficult to generalize that there is any one uptake, I think. But no, that's not research that I'm doing, but it is research that I know is happening across several disciplines, I think, with regard to people thinking about BTS and the LGBTQ community in Korea.
I think it's about time for one last question. And already Dr. F. Robertson has fielded many questions tonight. So she's on a roll here. So this final question here tonight. So when people get into fandom, what are the main ways they learn how to be an ARMY and what being an ARMY means?
That is such an excellent question. And I think that for most people, and speaking from my own personal experience and also from the interviews that I've collected, it really depends on how you find your way into the community. So for some, if you have in real life ARMY with you, you may learn certain practices or histories and contexts from that person or that community. For others, and you see this oftentimes on Twitter, people will say, you know, I'm baby Army, I have a question, or I'm trying to learn, and people will point them in multiple directions. Sometimes that might be useful. Sometimes if you're like me and you have a host of responses, you're trying to weed them out. But one of the other things that has been really delightful about this Army research is to see that there are any number of Army guides that people put together. And they will provide both history of BTS, history of Army, and also resources with regard to like how to prepare for a comeback. What does it mean to, you know, how to communicate during a V Live, all of these things. So I think that there are any number of fan-driven resources that probably provide the most direct assistance. And again, not everyone experiences, you know, being Army on Twitter, but I think for many people, that is one site that they try to learn to navigate with regard to getting information about how to participate in the community. And the other thing, I guess the last thing I would say is that it's really important to remember that there is no one way. And that's one of the delightful things that I've seen in this research, that people express that there's no one way to be Army. You know, being Army means that you support BTS, but that kind of support can manifest in any different number of ways. So from the Army theorists, you know, to people who are, you know, tracking or learning about charting history and numbers, to people who just want to experience the music and talk about that in community with others. There's no one way to go about doing it. And I think Army reflects that diversity quite well.
Thank you so much, Dr. S. Robertson, for your wonderful talk and insightful responses to the questions being raised tonight. And thank you to those of you in audience today for attending the session and for all your wonderful questions. Please join us for the third event of our webinar series, which will be 2 weeks from now, on November 5th at the same time, 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time. The talk will be concerning Korean literature and cinema's rise to prominence on the global stage. Thank you very much for your participation tonight, and good night.
Thank you for having me.